So today we've got an enormous Chaos rules drop, detachments for each one of the deities in Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle and Tzeentch, and perhaps some further clues that this might be the closest that we're getting to Codex Chaos Daemons in 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about perhaps the single biggest rules update for a 40k army in this Grotmas calendar. This is the big one with the 4 different detachments for mono deity demons. We're now well over halfway through Games Workshop's advent calendar for 40k detachments, 1 new detachment for every faction in the game, all fully playable with core match play rules and points cost for enhancements written inside. They'll be available on the app in January. As mentioned, it seems that day 16 is for the demons, with 1 for each of the deities. Yesterday we had the Imperial Guard with their Scion drop force, and tomorrow we've got the Leagues of Votann, which I think will be a fairly well anticipated one. Will be fun to see a different way to play for them. Chaos Daemons in Warhammer 40k are doing quite well for the average player, win rates are around about 53% pre-update, just a lot of strength and coming from their greater demons in particular, big scary stat lines, access to some cool tricks with the Shadow of Chaos, and also some permanently boosted enhancements now. They've tended to be more standout in terms of win rates versus actual tournament event wins, with other armies tending to be the ones that are winning the very big tournaments. The demons certainly have had some success still. Most lists do have a core of greater demons to lead the way, and then a few supporting things. The balance update doesn't look like it'll change too much for them. Screamer's got a higher points cost, but also some cool anti-vehicle melee profiles. Bloodletter's got a little bit cheaper at 110 points, which will be nice for them, though they did get one nerf with 3-inch deep strikes becoming 6-inch. In 10th edition, there's been a lot of chatter around the internet that Codex Chaos Daemons might well be going away. Certainly something that's been talked about many times in the past, though this time it could be more likely. The models will still be playable, but they'd be broken into their Deity Legion codexes, so Khorne Demons alongside World Eaters in their book, and Slaanesh alongside the new Emperor's Children when they release. It is kind of conspicuous that all the Deity Legions have been left till late in 10th edition. These Grotmas detachments certainly feel like they add a lot more evidence to that rumour in a couple of different ways. As basically, if there was going to be a Codex Chaos Daemons, then the detachments you'd expect in it would be these ones, the ones for each Chaos deity. And if there was a Codex Chaos Daemons coming for 10th edition, they wouldn't have shown off all those detachments at the same time as digital downloads. They're not doing that for any of the other armies in the game. It's also very conspicuous that Chaos Daemons are being treated differently on that, getting 4 different detachments where every other army gets 1. This to me feels like it's instead of Codex Chaos Daemons and not as well as. On top of that, in the documents themselves there does appear to be another clue. It looks like the artwork on the sides of each of these documents is actually more of Chaos Space Marines versus Chaos Demons, and that definitely isn't something that they had to do. They've got plenty of demon artwork if they wanted to use it, but it kind of implies that these detachments might well wind up being essentially supplemental ones to the individual Deity Legion books in the end, as opposed to supplements to a core Demons rule set. Definitely uncertain times for Codex Chaos Daemons collectors, and I must admit at time of recording I certainly wouldn't be getting into the faction to collect it undivided until the dust has settled, though it does look like if you want to collect any one Chaos Deities units, it seems the way to do that might well likely be to be in a codex alongside the Chaos Marines of that deity. In any case though, taking a look at the detachments themselves, we get 1 for each deity as mentioned. Khorne gets a Blood Legion, Nurgle gets a Plague Legion, Slaanesh gets a Legion of Excess, and Tzeentch gets a Scintillating Legion. The way they work is they don't lock out any of the other demon units, so as with other detachments in 10th edition, you could take, say, a Khorne Blood Legion and take a bit of Nurgle and Slaanesh along as allies, which I'm sure will just make Khorne angrier, but basically none of the detachment rules or stratagems or anything like that will help those other units. Literally every single rule is keyed to Khorne Demons in the Khorne detachment, and the same for the other deities in theirs. Just from raw datasheet strength and utility though, a little bit of mixing isn't going to be the worst thing in the world, though for each one of these you want to take the majority of your units as that deity's demons, otherwise there's no point in running the detachment. The rules they get for each one are really quite different, some of them more interesting than others, though it's interesting that they all have a walk-through wall style stratagem for their own deity's units, which can be quite big for the big scary greater demons in particular. All of this will be a trade out for the detachment rule from the core index, trading out the Warp Rifts rule from the Demon Incursion. That one gives you 6-inch deep strikes in the Shadow of Chaos or around the greater demons, which is really quite powerful for delivering scary units into melee near guaranteed. They'll also miss the 4+ Feel No Pain Great Unclean one, the Return to Reserve stratagem, the 6-inch deep strike stratagem, and easy access to advance and charge. All of those are pretty powerful boosts, and there's some other really good greater demon enhancements as well. You'd also be passing up the list building flexibility of having all of those options work on all the Chaos deities as opposed to just one of them as well. Getting into it though, and first up we have the Blood Legion for Khorne. This one gets a 2-part special rule. First up, and probably the most impactful one, is Murder Call. This one allows Khorne units to do a surge move of d6 inches towards the enemy unit each time an enemy unit finishes a normal or advanced move within 6 inches of your Khorne unit. Basically, this means that if the opponent moves up to near your scary melee stuff, you get to roll a d6 and move that far closer to them, potentially engaging them in close combat. Though you will be able to do this just the once per phase due to the core FAQ about the surge move rules. You can only do this core bit against normal and advanced moves, so not in reaction to falling back, though there is a stratagem to do the latter if you want to. Just in general, it seems really quite intimidating. I feel like it has a big incentive to push a big scary unit up the board as fast as possible, and then make opponents have the difficult choice as to whether or not they move close to it and trigger that surge move, because if they don't and it's got a 6-inch exclusion zone around it, they might well not be able to move a whole bunch of their army up very far at all. With a 6-inch move, you'd usually only need a 5+ to get into engagement range, so if the opponent does go inside the range, even at maximal distance, you still have a pretty reasonable chance to engage them in close combat, though I guess for enemy melee troops they could just charge you just out of 6 inches. Plus if the enemy is getting that close in the first place, it's likely that your unit's going to be taking a whole bunch of damage, so I guess it's all very threatening up to the point where they actually just take huge chunks out of your Khorne unit. Definitely seems interesting though, and could be really threatening for Khorne taking the mid-board objectives. Otherwise, for their second bit, they've also got Blood Tainters. This one basically gives you the sticky objectives type rule if you slay an enemy unit on an objective, so it basically remains yours until your opponent controls it at the end of any phase. I feel like that one's just going to happen sometimes just incidentally. You're going to be wanting to kill enemy units off the mid-board and take it yourself, and I guess it means that if your opponent then just goes to shoot you down, you'll still have that point. Feels all very fluffy as well, consecrating the objectives in blood. Before we move on to the stratagems, I'll just give a shout out to today's video sponsor in Deploymats. These guys could be one option if you want a surface to play Warhammer 40k on. These guys make gaming mats with a sort of neoprene mouse mat sort of style, sold on their Etsy store from Australia. The idea behind these is they're 60 by 44 inches, so the right size for 10th edition games, and they've got a couple of different designs in a chaos landscape and an overgrown factory. The mat's double-sided so you get both, and then basically softly included in the design itself, you can make out the Pariah Nexus deployment lines, so when you come to set up a game everything's pre-measured, and it even has little trinkets on the board for the exact positions of the objectives as well, which is kind of cool. The mats are most efficient to get if you're in Australia, 198 Australian dollars, plus $19 shipping usually. Around the rest of the world it can be a bit pricier, £160 to the UK or $170 to the USA, due to shipping and import charges. There is also the single-sided option as well if you just want the one or the other, but not the both designs. It's a bit cheaper than the both-sided one. In any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description, and a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. Moving on though, let's get into some Khorne Stratagems for the Blood Legion. We're starting out with a couple of good ones here. A 4+ chance to fight on death for 1 command point for Wrath Undeniable. This one's basically always good whenever you've got a melee army. Often you might well just be charging in, destroying an enemy unit, then when it comes to the opponent's turn, they charge your unit and kill it back in turn. This means that you can drag down a good chunk of that enemy unit that destroyed them at the same time. As with the rest of the stratagems, they're all locked to Khorne units, as with each of these Deity Detachments. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Gore-Hungry Onslaught. This allows you to move through terrain pieces in your movement phase or charge phase. This one's great for things like Bloodthirsters or Blood Crushers deciding to stage and charge the enemy from behind ruins. Not having to go around the edge of ruins means that they can hide in a corner and go somewhere really quite aggressive, and then have a massive threat range across the board. This one seems like a really nice one to deliver something from safety into glorious close combat. For 1 CP, we've got Blood Beget Skulls. This one allows you to advance and charge. Again, absolutely excellent to have on a melee army, and isn't dependent on being in the shadow of chaos or anything like that, so a bit more flexible there. I guess if you had the command points to burn, you could even combine it with the previous one for just a ridiculous threat range from behind terrain. After that, we've got a 2 CP one called Fool's Flight. This one allows you to charge an enemy unit that fell back and ended its movement within 6 inches of your unit. This one feels a little bit like Heroic Intervention in a way, as you have to charge the squad within 6, and also you don't get fights first either, so depending on the order of the combat, if you're not charged you could still wind up fighting first there. This one's pricey, but if it does make the difference between just basically catching up with an enemy and destroying it in their own turn, or letting them go, this could absolutely easily be worth it. It means that there's a lot of value in destroying an enemy unit and then piling into the next one, and potentially it means that whether or not that unit falls back you still might be able to kill them. Models with a 6-inch move might not be able to actually get out of 6-inch range, as if they happen to be in base contact they need to move absolutely perfectly back, and if they don't then they'll still be within 6. If they're blocked by other models or terrain then that won't happen. If you've even wrapped the enemy unit just a tiny bit they'll probably not be able to escape, or if they had a 5-inch move characteristic or something. This one could be really big, as it could stop your Khorne unit from getting shot as well as potentially getting more skulls for the Skull Throne. Talking of skulls, next up we have Skulls Beget Blood, the counterpart to Blood Beget Skulls from earlier I suppose. This one's basically Khorne grenades, throwing a bunch of explosive skulls into the enemy. As an infantry or mounted unit gets to make essentially a normal grenade attack, 8-inch range and 66 for a mortal wound on 4+. I feel like the grenade style stratagem is often just handy enough to have, potentially being able to deal with something with high saves, or do just a tiny bit of damage in the shooting phase before you charge in, and can be good against certain targets like those with -1 damage, like maybe a Redemptor Dreadnought. Then for one command point we've got Sheath in Brass. This one's an interesting durability boost, as it basically gives your unit a 3+ save against enemy shooting. Demons are usually saving on their invulnerable save, so units like Bloodletters would normally be a 5+. Having that jump up to a 3 is kind of massive against lower AP things. It's worth it against AP1 or AP0, and even more so if you have cover. Feels like this one could be a pretty easy one to use if you think that your Bloodletters are going to get chewed up by a bunch of low AP volume fire. Then for the enhancements we've got Slaughterthirst. This one gives an aura of lance melee to non-monster units within 6 inches. Feels like a solid boost for Bloodletters, or I guess the Hellblades of Blood Crushers. It does overlap on the Skullmaster's buff though, who I feel like would be the obvious choice for this one in a Bloodletter squad. I guess could be handy for the Juggernaut Herald maybe. Next up, for 20 points, there's Fury's Cage. This one's for a monster unit only, and basically it's a way to take D3+1 mortal wounds on your own model to get some absolutely staggering melee power. If you had a Bloodthirster hitting on a 2+ and wounding on a 3+, effectively that's a plus 50% damage boost to him. I think for 20 points and taking the damage, that could easily be worth it against the right high value targets. I think that the damage that you take does actually take the edge off it a little bit. You could be losing 4 wounds worth of big scary Khorne monster to pay for the damage buff. I feel like it makes this one that you could have but not necessarily use literally every time. Next up for 15 points, there's Brazen Maw. This one gives you a +2 to your charges. I think for 15 points this is pretty easy to have on just about any Khorne unit. I guess in theory you could use it out of Deep Strike for a 9-inch drop becoming a 7-inch charge, and then with reroll that's an 83% chance to make it. It seems absolutely fine for stuff on the board as well, just to make their threat range that bit better. I quite like that one for the cost. Then finally we've got a nice fun one called Gateway unto Damnation. This one's 10 points and it makes your Deadly Demise go off on a 2+. If your units happen to have killed something in the game, then that gets boosted to a D3+3 mortal wounds. So it basically means that if this unit dies in the midst of the enemy army, it's going to go off like an absolute bomb, potentially doing kind of horrendous damage to a whole bunch of units. I feel like for 10 points this one seems seriously quite fun. I feel like you want to be having it on a monster that you throw up the board with a bit more recklessness earlier in the game. I guess to be a Bloodthirster or a Demon Prince given the monster keyword. Maybe making a long charge from behind terrain or similar, and then the opponent's got the headache of if they destroy it they need to be far away from it, and if they reduce it down to say just a wound or 2, you could even think about just flying it over and charging something that'll kill it, if it means that you manage to catch a whole bunch of enemies in that massive mortal wound aura. I'd certainly be tempted to take that one, it looks really fun. Overall for the Khorne detachment I think they've done pretty well with it, feels like there's enough to make scary melee things happen well. Those surge moves would be problematic for things on the mid-board, and basically make your opponent want to back off a good amount and try and destroy the Khorne units before they think about getting too close to them. And the sticky objectives bonus bit doesn't really hurt either. I feel like that's going to trigger just naturally a few times in the game, unless things are going kind of badly. Otherwise, advance and charge, move through terrain and fights on death are all really handy for a melee army. The 2 command point one to catch a falling back unit could be absolutely massive. The +2 to charge is out of reserve, and all the other strats and enhancements also seem fine and usable, as opposed to being bad. I feel like the big trade-off for this one is losing the 6-inch charge from reserves that you get in the Demon Incursion, which is kind of great for Khorne units. You can have a Bloodthirster swoop in and drop Bloodletters next to it, and then they can also go charging something else for some glorious turns worth of melee. And it feels like Deep Strike delivery won't be quite as guaranteed. Maybe you might have a bit more focus on things like rapid ingress as a result, or charging from behind terrain. For initial impressions though, I think it looks solid enough for a valid Khorne detachment. I don't feel like this one's awful. And in general their units have been pretty effective in competitive play. I feel like mono Khorne demons is something that people have done a bit more than some of the other deities. Moving on to Nurgle next, who get the Plague Legion, and unfortunately for the followers of the Grandfather, it doesn't really look like this detachment is going to make many people very happy. The core rule is unfortunately a bit of a Shadow of Chaos style Battle Shock one, which I think genuinely will be helpful, but maybe not in the sort of way that feels very exciting. It means that your Shadow of Chaos has a 9-inch aura from all Nurgle units, so it means that most of the board will be in the Shadow most of the time. It means that whenever you pass a Battle Shock test, if you're below half strength, you'll start regenerating. And if enemies test Battle Shock, then they'll be at -1 to the test, and they'll take mortal wounds when they fail. On its own, that'll be super underwhelming just due to not having too many Battle Shock tests to hand out, but in this one you also get to hand out one Battle Shock test to one enemy unit both in your command phase and in the enemy one. They'd basically be testing Battle Shock at -1 to the test, take mortal wounds if failed, and could be a direct thing that just stops them getting victory points, as it's a different command phase rule as well. It'll be happening outside of the normal Battle Shock step of the command phase, so I believe you wouldn't be able to use Insane Bravery to auto-pass either. Over the course of the game, even against Leadership 6 armies, that's still going to be a bunch of failed tests, a fair few mortal wounds, and hopefully a few victory points denied. I guess in theory, if the game plan for Nurgle is just to march up to the mid-board and survive there at all cost and play the scoring game, that could maybe be useful to outscore, though I feel like Battle Shock's just really quite unreliable to have as your core detachment rule really. It's rarely a feel-good one. I think that Nurgle players would have been hoping for something that helps out with either damage or defense or both, and trying to make them a bit more of an army that can go toe-to-toe with the enemy, whether that's by dealing a bit more damage to them or by being yet more excessively durable. Moving on to the stratagems, and we have a couple of damage dealer ones first. Critical hits on a 5+ in the fight phase means that lethal hits will be going off on a 5+ for your various Nurgle things. That could be stacking really quite a lot of auto wounds on something, and could maybe combine with an enhancement that gives you extra AP. I feel like perhaps the limiting factor of this one though is that most of the Nurgle units just aren't really excessively scary damage dealers. Maybe it could just about work on plague drones or something. For one command point, there's Fever Visions. This one gives you a +1 to hit when shooting or fighting, so basically an alternative damage boost there. And then after that, one of the enemy units hit by the attacks have to test a Battle Shock test, so again at -1 to the test with a chance to deal some mortal wounds as an added bonus. I guess you could use it on Nurgle Soul Grinders as well if you wanted. For one command point, we've got Rotten Renewal. This one's a movement or charge phase one, and it's the one that allows you to move through terrain features. I guess this one's probably going to be best on Great Unclean ones or Soul Grinders. They've got a lot of weight and big defensive profiles, so maybe part of the challenge is to actually get them to the mid-board and stay there. I guess this could potentially help with that, maybe having one ghost through a wall while other ones take up the movement lanes. It could also allow plague drones to charge from behind cover if you wanted to try and make them work. For one command point, we've got Merc Shadow. This one allows an infantry unit to add 5 to a normal move, so you could have 10-inch moving plague bearers that could still charge after that. I guess that could allow them to zoom up pretty rapidly to the mid-board, and if you had an objective within 10 inches, it'd be nice to guarantee that you could absolutely get there without risking an advance. They are a unit that don't exactly have excessive damage when they get there though, so it'd be more for sort of board control and utility. Next up for a big 2 command points is Feated Resurgence. This one restores either 1 destroyed model to a unit, D3 plague bearers, or D3 +1 wounds to a monster. I think that if this was 1 command point, then the plague bearers or the monster things would be more interesting, but at 2 command points it's just not really very efficient for those. I guess in theory you could do movement shenanigans with the plague bearers, perhaps putting more down on an objective that you're just about to try and contest or score, or have them go closer to the enemy to shorten the charge. I think in reality though probably the best thing to use this on are the Beasts of Nurgle. They're 65 points each, and if you had a 2 beast squad and it got knocked down to 1, you could essentially have a beast spring up from the dead. I think 2 CP for 65 points is a bit more reasonable than some of the other options. I feel like it's maybe just super intimidating that you could have 2 Beasts of Nurgle, and as they ping back to full health, unless your opponent literally manages to wipe out both of them with their tanky stat lines, it's all going to be the same 2 Beasts of Nurgle just sat there if you can spare the CP. That does sound super annoying to have to deal with really, but at the same time this one's a really pricey one, and it's going to deny you other options. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Plague of Woes. This one doubles down on the detachment rule, making another unit within 9 inches of the first one that you tested Battle Shock on also have to take a Battle Shock test, and you can only do this one in the enemy command phase, not in yours. I guess if there's any chance that this could give you another shot at denying some victory points on a primary objective, then that'd be nice. And you'd also have the small chance of some mortal wounds. I guess if there was an enemy unit that, say, had 2 wounds left, and this could be the difference between them just suddenly dying and not being able to do any of their damage, then it could be massive. Though I guess you'd always choose the most important thing first, so you'd essentially be getting this one for the second most important one. I'm sure occasionally it'd be worth it, though it seems just a little bit on the niche side. Finally for Nurgle, we've got the enhancements. Canker Blight is a 15.1. If a battle shock test is failed within 6 inches, instead of taking the D3 mortal wounds, instead you just destroy one model from the enemy unit if it makes sense to. It doesn't work on monster or vehicles, otherwise you could have Land Raiders or Demon Primarchs vanishing instantly. But that still seems kind of interesting. If you say targeted some scary elite Terminators or something, the chance to have one of them just disappear with a bad roll could be fun. Seems like it could be at least interesting to have on a Great Unclean one, just to have one other way to deal some fairly scary damage as well as its other profiles. And feels like this would be quite good with any of the other things that could double down on generating more battle shock tests. Say that +1 to hit at shooting and fighting style one, or maybe even borrowing a few skull cannons from Khorne to generate more tests. I feel like it's only really going to be super standout against some very scary enemy elites though, maybe stuff like Adeptus Custodes. They'll still be failing on less than a 7 in this detachment. Next up, we've got Maggot's Maws for 15 points. One unit within 6 takes a battle shock test in the shooting phase, and also takes D3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 3+, but it gets those mortal wounds instead of the Draft of Terror and not as well as. Again, I guess extra battle shock really isn't too bad in this detachment, and I suppose it's essentially a small mortal wound shooting attack up close, where the battle shock's kind of an added bonus. I guess you could have a Great Unclean one with this one next to the one with the other one to remove models, though I feel like you're probably doing a lot of setup there for just a small chance where they could still just pass the battle shock test anyway. Next up, we've got Droning Shroud for 35 points. This one's monster only, so Great Unclean one or Demon Prince, and units within 6 inches can't be shot by units that are greater than 18 inches away. This one seems like one of the best things for the detachment, essentially adding Bellacor's big buff to the centre of your army for just a few points more. That one does feel kind of painful. If you're going heavy on the Nurgle datasheets, you wouldn't be able to shoot them with your big guns early in the game if you were playing against a gun line. I feel like maybe having 1 or 2 less turns to deal with all the big stat line profiles perhaps might mean that you just survive onto the mid-board objectives towards the end of the game. If you are going for a big durability, outscore the enemy sort of game plan, as seems to be the incentive here. Finally for 20 points we've got Font of Spores. This one's monster only, and he gets to improve the AP of Nurgle units by 1 within 6 inches. This one seems like it's actually one of the best damage improvements in the army. Most of the Nurgle units have low AP, which I think really limits them against a lot of targets out there, so getting the potential to have more AP on a bunch of units I think is really nice. It'd work on the Great Unclean one themselves as well if you put it on that and not a Demon Prince. It'd also work on ranged characteristics like Soul Grinders if you wanted. I think I'd be very tempted to have this one on a Great Unclean one. Overall, I feel like this one is probably going too much onto the unreliable battle shock type things. The detachment rule does genuinely look like it'll chip away at the enemy with some mortal wounds and deny some victory points from time to time, but a bit randomly, and sometimes it'll do great, sometimes it won't. And otherwise I feel like actually the enhancements like the prevent shooting one and the extra AP one are 2 of the best boosts. And just the idea of having 2 Beasts of Nurgle with one of them able to revive for 2 command points seems ridiculously annoying, though 2 command points for that maybe isn't the hugest swing in the world, and it might just be more that the opponent decides to ignore them. Otherwise I feel like quite a lot of the other stratagems just aren't super standout when they're applied to Nurgle units. I feel like they perhaps needed a little bit more in terms of the damage dealing sort of thing. It would have been nice to have a few more ways to make plague drones more obviously very scary. I don't know if you could maybe use this to have some sort of great big Nurgle stat check type list, perhaps with multiple Great Unclean ones and multiple Soul Grinders. I've seen a couple of those lists being played in tournaments. As mentioned though, the internet reaction to this one really hasn't been very positive whatsoever. It's generally being seen as not really quite enough for what Nurgle players want is to get a bit more use out of Plague Bearers and Plague Drones and things, as they're more rank and file damage dealer units. Onto the Dark Prince now, and next up we have Slaanesh with their Legion of Excess, and their detachment goes completely the other way, potentially making their army more exposed to a bit of damage in the fight phase, but getting some kind of horrifically scary damage in return. The detachment rule gives you 4 back and charge at its first bit, which helps out in protracted combats and means that they won't be able to be locked up as a way to deal with them. But also it's a big deal for triggering the second part, which is the Seductive Gambit. This one's really quite an unusual rule with some big trade-offs but masses of damage. You can basically elect to use this when you're fighting and you've just made a charge move. And basically the trade-off is that you lose fights first, so the enemy could well be striking before you, but you also gain reroll all hits and all wounds in melee, which is an absolutely staggering melee damage boost against certain targets that can often be effectively just double damage right then and there. That means that against the right things, the army is going to be just hilariously scary. Pretty much most of the Slaanesh units really like this. It seems absolutely monstrous on the Keeper of Secrets or Celeste. They've both got lots of mid-strength and OK AP sort of attacks, which get on amazingly with reroll wound rolls. And then Demonettes and Fiends will both really enjoy as well. Their profile's just a base, will be getting a lot out of it, but it means that you could also double up on devastating wounds if that was the main way to go. Potentially even re-rolling everything that wasn't a 6 if you just wanted to punch through as many of those as possible. It does mean that you'll be likely taking some damage before you get to strike with this, so if you say we're charging a Keeper of Secrets into something that can actually really fight quite hard, it could potentially be quite a big trade-off. If the opponent swings first and takes massive damage off your unit, then it could well not have been worth having the big damage boost, and instead just fighting first with your base profile, so it seems like it's going to be best for doing things like killing enemy tanks or wiping out squads of infantry that won't be super strong in melee. A fair few Slaanesh things aren't exactly enormously tough on the defensive kind of profile either, so I feel like it's certainly easier to use on things like the Keepers of Secrets or other fairly tough stuff like that, where certain infantry units just aren't really going to do very much against them even if they do get to swing first. There is an interesting durability stratagem that could maybe keep Demonettes safe while they do the damage, though that does have trade-offs and taking damage elsewhere. I feel like this is definitely one that has massive potential, but you might need just to play a little bit smarter with compared with some rules. For other thoughts, I guess if you're making absolutely loads of charges across the board, then it might not matter that all of your units don't have fights first. You'd be alternating with your opponents, so at least some of your units would still be able to strike before the enemy and then also hit hard with this. And it does mean that the Transweaver in this detachment seems like a less obviously good idea, given that it's basically the same as her buff, which I guess could still be handy to have it on a unit that you want to fight first against, but still seems a bit less good by comparison. Overall though, I feel like this is definitely a strong enough detachment rule to build around, just crazy extra damage for every unit that can afford to make melee and take some hits first. Certainly gun lines or armies that don't fight hard in close combat won't enjoy this. Otherwise, for stratagems, we've got Thieves of Pain for one command point. This one's the weird durability style one. You can use this in any phase where you're taking damage, potentially if you're about to take some damage in melee before you're activating with those scary rerolls. And then you nominate another unit within 12 inches, and each time a wound is allocated to you, instead that unit takes a mortal wound instead. I guess in theory it means that if you're going to take a bunch of chip damage to Demonettes or Fiends or something, you could bounce that damage onto, say, a Keeper of Secrets or some nearby Seekers or Seeker Chariot or something, and keep your unit completely intact and ready to fight with that massive damage. It could just be good for trying to do some annoying preserving, to keep one unit alive that your opponent thought they might have been able to otherwise easily kill. Though I do feel like you'd have to be kind of careful with it. You aren't really actually saving yourself any damage being taken for your army overall. And there aren't really any units that are just super obvious targets that can just afford to soak up a bunch of wounds like that and not care too much. Most of the Slaanesh stuff tends to have points per wound of around about 8 or 9 or so. So whichever way you're taking damage, it is going to get hit kind of hard. I guess you could potentially save against the mortal wounds with the Shining Aegis of the Keeper of Secrets potentially. That still means that you'd be taking a bunch of mortal wounds on a big and important creature. Overall though, it definitely seems interesting and powerful though again would maybe take a bit of skill as to how to get the best out of it. Next up, for 2 CP, we've got Archagonists. This means that 1 monster or 2 non-monsters get a +1 to wound in melee. That's really quite a big damage boost, and particularly if you combine it with the detachment rerolls, but comes at a hefty cost at 2 command points. I think it means that you'd only be using it absolutely when you really need it. Though still, it could be really nasty for, say, a unit of Fiends fighting with OK AP and damage profiles or something, or if a Keeper of Secrets desperately needs to take down a massive enemy heavy hitter. Affecting 2 non-monster units does make it a bit more viable. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Phantasmal Longing. This one's the move through terrain features one. Again, this one seems rather great for a Keeper of Secrets, Shalaxi or Celeste to get them into combat really quite a long way away. There isn't an advance and charge stratagem in this detachment though, so I guess that's a bit of a trade out versus the core index. Again though, like with Khorne, it's really nice. Have a big scary monster hiding behind a ruin, and then just zoom straight through and hit something a really long way away. For 1 command point, there's Cavalcade of Blades. This one gives you mortal wound impact hits on the charge on a 4+. You roll 1d6 per model that you got into engagement range for most units, or 6d6 if you charged in with a monster unit. Maybe not so enormously different from Tank Shock in terms of yield there. Against the right enemy, that certainly could be some nice extra damage. I guess it means that you could potentially stop the enemy from hitting you quite so hard before you activated damage buffs too, if they did manage to kill an extra model or 2. I guess if the stars align, you could even use that to potentially kill an enemy unit and then use your pile-in move to jump into the next enemy unit, where if they couldn't activate first, then it would mean that you'd be striking them first with all the hit and wound rerolls. Next up, we've got Sensory Excruciation for 1 command point. This one happens in your command phase, and it means that basically every unit, friend or foe, takes a battle shock test when they're within the Shadow of Chaos, with a -1 to the test if they're below half strength. You need to have at least one Slaanesh monster on the board to be able to trigger this one. It does seem kind of interesting. There's a designer's note by it to say that it means that you could potentially be healing some of your units, as well as causing some mortal wounds on the enemy. Though to be honest, I feel like it's going to hurt you more than it helps you most of the time. I think to even consider it, you'd probably want Shadow of Chaos in the midboard, and for you to have multiple units on every single objective so you don't have chances of losing them. But even then, the timing and everything just doesn't really feel like it works out. I feel like there's at least a good chance you just trigger this here, fail some battle shocks, and then deny yourself some own primary points, or at the cost of a command point. I feel like this one needed some nudges to actually make it worth it, maybe a higher chance for your units to pass the battle shock or something like that. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Overwhelming Excess. This one's a debuff when an enemy unit shoots a Slaanesh unit. They take a battle shock test at -1 to the test, which could be -2 if they're within Shadow of Chaos as well. If they pass the test, then they're going to be -1 to hit when they're shooting, which could be handy enough as a durability debuff. But if they fail the test, then they're just fully not able to shoot that unit at all, and that enemy unit can redeclare its shots elsewhere if it's got another viable target. This one's definitely unreliable, but also quite interesting, I think. I feel like if the opponent's just got one big scary shooting unit that they really need to kill one of your big scary greater demons with, it could be worth having a go at this. There's at least a reasonable chance they'd fail the test and then have to dedicate their guns elsewhere, potentially to something far less worthy of them. And as a consolation prize they get -1 to hit, but that only applies to other things that wouldn't be Keepers of Secrets as they're already -1 to hit anyway. I guess could be good if you're trying to divert fire from Shalaxi Hellbane maybe. Finally, for enhancements, we've got 4 of them here. First up, there's a pair of them called False Majesty and Dreaming Crown. These ones are a bit weird and they're basically the same enhancement. They're both a 6-inch aura to buff melee attacks. One of them's +1 to hit rolls and one of them's +1 to wound rolls. Neither of them apply to monster units, so they can't help Demon Princes or Keepers of Secrets or anything like that. I feel like out of the two, the wound roll ones are usually going to be a fair bit more important. In general, they're going to be at least as good as the hit rolls, if not better, unless you were already wounding on a 2. So that one would certainly be my first choice. I guess maybe it could be good for a Keeper of Secrets to bear it alongside some Fiends charging in or something like that. I feel like the trickiest bit might just be the slight clunkiness of trying to make this into combat and still being in range of the units that you want to boost. I guess you could put it on a Transweaver, though it does sort of feel like you're paying for the detachment rules again with her. Then otherwise we've got Avatar of Perfection for 15 points. This will make, say, Keeper of Secrets or Demon Prince a bit faster if it's not near other stuff. You get to reroll advanced rolls, reroll charge rolls and ignore movement modifiers, provided that you're not within 6 inches of friendlies. I guess in some games, if there's some way to debuff the movement in a big way, it could be nice. I feel like in most games though, it's not really going to matter all that much. Finally, for 10 points, there's Soul Glutton. Destroy a model in the fight phase and heal D3 wounds at the end of it. That's for monsters only, and again, probably for Keepers of Secrets. That one seems absolutely fine as a points filler. If it manages to activate once or twice, it's probably justified itself. Overall, this definitely seems like one of the most interesting ones. The detachment rule might be a little bit hard to use, but that crazy amount of extra damage definitely is interesting. Seems fairly monstrous against ranged armies in particular. The melee stuff you'd have to play a bit more carefully against. It does seem very good on Keepers of Secrets, who become just pretty generally great against everything with that on the go. And they also seem like the sort of unit that's a lot more likely to tank a bunch of hits before being able to strike, at least compared with a few of the other Slaanesh things. Otherwise, Keepers of Secrets walking through walls for 1 command point seems really nice. Bouncing damage from one unit to another is a potentially really interesting tricky shenanigan, and could really help you win some positional fights even if you're still taking about the same amount of damage overall. That +1 to wound enhancement could be okay. I feel like most of the other stratagems and enhancements are usable enough, they just need to be in the right situation. Overall seems like one of the most interesting out of the detachments. It feels like it'd be good against ranged stuff, but harder to use against melee. I guess for trade-offs against the Demon Incursion, you'd be losing close-range deep strike charges and no advance and charge stratagem option, and your army would probably feel really quite fragile if you are going heavy on the Slaanesh things. Overall though, seems pretty cool. Finally, we've perhaps got the most weird and crazy one, which appropriately is the Scintillating Legion of Tzeentch. I feel like Games Workshop often decides to give Tzeentch some sort of weird dice manipulation thing, and they absolutely have here, with the core rule of this one being Fates in Flux. You've got a resource called Flux Tokens, which you start at the battle with 3 of them, and your opponent starts the game with 0. You can either spend these Flux Tokens on stratagems, or you can use them to reroll an advanced roll, hit roll, wound roll, damage roll, saving throw, or hazardous test. So basically kind of similar to a command point reroll, but a few less targets. You can't use them on charge rolls, for example. The weird thing is that basically as you spend Flux Tokens, your opponent gains them. So if you use one on this or on a stratagem, then they will gain 1 and you will lose 1. And then your opponent can basically use them on similar rolls, but they're only able to do it on advanced rolls, hit rolls, wound rolls, and saving throws, so they can't use them on hazardous tests or on damage rolls. Again, if your opponent then spends those points, then they pass them back to you. So you could basically have a game where you're just pinging rerolls between each player, potentially rerolling a staggering amount of dice if both players go really heavy on them. And then just to add to the madness and make sure that you have at least some, if your opponent happens to have at least 1 Flux token, then you get to gain 1 in your command phase, just full stop. So new rerolls will enter the game on your side. I feel like this one's definitely interesting and feels all very Tzeentch. I guess the minigame would basically be to try and get more value out of these rerolls than your opponent does, and if you think you can't do that, then probably just don't bother rerolling them. The same would be true of both sides. I guess higher values out of those rerolls could often be rerolling a saving throw, particularly say a 4+ invulnerable save against a big scary anti-tank weapon on something like a Lord of Change, or re-rolling a great big damage result that wounded on a 2 but you failed it, as opposed to just randomly re-rolling smaller things for units that don't matter so much. It does feel super weird that your detachment rule basically helps out your opponent almost as much as you though. I feel like plenty of armies out there could easily gain more advantage out of these re-rolls if anything, particularly armies with massively powerful anti-tank weapons, or say big scary vehicles that might have 2+ armor saves and could get a lot of value out of re-rolling them. At first impressions I'd probably say that it doesn't look enormously strong, but it definitely looks fun. For the stratagems, first up we've got Impossible Eclipse. A monster unit calls this and either declares no man's land or the enemy deployment zone or both, and that area becomes in your Shadow of Chaos for this phase only. If you also burn a flux point, then you can have both of them. This would be better if you could use the Shadow for 6-inch Deep Strikers and Charge maybe, but you can't use that because that's in the Demon Incursion, so I guess the idea would be to use it in either yours or your opponent's command phase to get either the regeneration or mortal wounds on battle shocks. I just really can't see that being worth it for 1 command point though, not unless your opponent just happens to be taking a staggering number of battle shock tests for all sorts of injured units that are below half strength, and even then it feels a little bit questionable to be fishing for a few mortal wounds or -1 to test for that. For 2 CP, there's Pyrogenesis. This one gives you +2 strength to your range or melee weapons. And for 2 command points, you can spend a Flux token to make it a big +3 to your strength and an extra 1 AP on top of that. This one is a bit unfortunately pricey. 2 command points and 1 of your Flux token rerolls, so a lot going on there. It does mean that you could have a unit of Flamers all the way up at strength 7 AP2 though, which is pretty terrifying. That's the sort of profile that goes from being not really very threatening against things like Terminators to taking a massive chunk out of a unit, and it also seems very nice on the Lord of Change's shooting attacks if it was going to be attacking something from toughness 10 to toughness 12, where both the strength increase and the AP matter. It definitely seems like one of the more interesting things, though comes with an absolutely massive price tag. Then for 1 command point we've got Fateborn Nightmares. This one's the move through terrain feature one. I think this one feels a bit less useful for Tzeentch to be honest. It could be okay for a Lord of Change, or there's a scary Demon Prince enhancement that you could have that could fight really hard, and feels like he could be a good target for that for charging out from behind terrain. Next up for 1 CP we've got Fickle Fire. This one's a slightly oddly worded one, where basically for the phase, your Tzeentch unit doesn't count as being in engagement range of all the units that they are within engagement range of. So that basically means that you can target those enemy units with shooting attacks, both with that unit and with other stuff. So potentially douse them in a bunch of warp fire while you remain in close combat. If any enemy models are slain within engagement range, then on a 5+ your own unit takes a mortal wound as a bit of very literal friendly fire I suppose. I guess if you're lining up a whole bunch of warp fire shooting with multiple units of flamers, Lords of Change and all sorts of other stuff, you wouldn't need to drop back with a unit of horrors or something that was being gummed up in the midboard, and the horrors themselves could still shoot. It seems maybe a little bit on the niche side though, given that I guess you're using this so your unit can still shoot without falling back, and things like Lords of Change will be able to anyway as they're monsters, and Flamers can do that anyway, given that they've got that on their datasheet. I feel like in reality the amount of times that you'd actually want to use this just aren't really all that much. Next up for 1 command point we've got Flickering Reality. Again, this one's weird dice manipulation. When your unit's attacked in the fight phase, you roll a dice, and then basically any attacks that roll that exact number that the opponent uses, they won't be able to hit you on that number. If you spend a flux token, then you can re-roll that exact number to give you a better chance to not roll something that your opponent was going to hit you on anyway, like a 1 or a 2. The biggest value for this is if you happen to get lucky and roll a 6, as if you get that, then apparently it also cancels out any lethal or sustained hits, and that could actually be a really big durability boost. Again though, for 1 command point, plus giving your opponent another reroll, it just doesn't really seem all that great though. Effectively, it's an unreliable -1 to hit in melee pretty much, unless you happen to get lucky and roll that 6. That'd be a lot better, but there's a pretty good chance that you don't get that if it's important, and there's at least some chance that you manage to roll like a double 1 or something, and the stratagem and your flux token do nothing. I feel like it could be one to gamble on if a -1 to hit is all you really wanted in the fight phase, and particularly if your opponent's got some sort of nasty sustained or lethal hits combo on the go, and you could try and fish for that and make them suddenly far less dangerous. Finally, for 1 command point, we've got Delirium Unmade. This one's a return to reserves one, either one unit that's outside of engagement range in the fight phase, or you can spend a flux token to do it on 2 units, and those units can be ones that are in engagement range, so quite a powerful ability to just have things melt away to reserves, even if your opponent charges them. As ever with these, it triggers at the end of the enemy fight phase. I feel like for reliable value, this one's probably one of the best ones, allowing magical firepower to go off into reserves, and then deep strike somewhere at 9 inches is all very handy, lining up some shots on other things, and giving you the opportunity to get in the right places to do secondaries if it makes sense. Overall seems nice, though you do have the option to basically do this in the regular detachment, though it's a bit more limited, and isn't able to rescue things from engagement range, with a double version being locked to Shadow of Chaos as well, so you might not have as many choices. Then finally we've got the enhancements. First up we've got Inescapable Eye for 10 points. This one means that you generate 2 flux tokens in your command phase if your opponent has any. I feel like a fair bit of the time you might be able to make them have any, say if you did the last saving throws in the previous turn, then they might not have the opportunity to spend them again, so you could generate more that way. Either way, it basically guarantees that you've got at least some flux tokens to use on rerolls or stratagems as you should see fit. I feel like this one does look like it's well worth having on the board somewhere for just 10 points. Then we've got Infernal Puppeteer, which is 10 points. This one allows a monster unit to essentially draw line of sight when it's shooting from another Tzeentch unit within 9 inches. So you could maybe have some horrors on a mid-board objective, a Lord of Change hidden behind a ruin, and then he can see out of their eyes and blast something with all of his warp magic. That one does seem quite nice, just for the amount of extra shooting options you might have with it, and it could allow him to basically kind of shoot around corners. Again, for 10 points, this one seems one that's very easy to throw on and probably has enough value. Next up, for 20 points, we've got the Neverblade. That sounds like it's the equivalent of the Everstave, but for this detachment. This one's monster only, so gives you either a Scary Demon Prince or Lord of Change. It makes your melee weapons +2 strength, +1 attack, and an extra AP -1, and also a +1 to hit in melee. Again, I think that if you're running this detachment, I would absolutely have that somewhere. That feels like one of the better ones, transforming a Demon Prince into a bit of a monster with 10 attacks at strength 10 and damage 3, and all with better AP as well, which is seriously punchy. And it makes a Lord of Change melee go from kind of bad to genuinely fairly good. Quite well rounded, with a bunch of shooting damage followed up by a bunch of melee damage. For 20 points, I think that's definitely worth having. Finally, we've got the Improbable Shield, which is 30 points. This one's a 6-inch aura of 4+ feel no pain against psychic attacks and mortal wounds. A bit of a weird one, this one. It gives you essentially double durability against those sort of things, but they're the sort of attacks that only come up against some armies and not against others. I guess it just depends on how often you're actually going to run into psychic attacks or mortal wounds. They're present in some things in 40k, but not everywhere right now. It'd be nasty against the Thousand Suns or maybe some Tyranids lists, though significantly less so against other things. I think against the general field at the moment I wouldn't bother with it, just for all the games where the 30 points won't be doing anything. Overall though, this does feel like one of the weirdest detachments. I must admit I'm not the biggest fan really, despite quite liking Tzeentch flamery things. I feel like actually some of the enhancements are some of the better bits. Having an extra punchy Lord of Change or a massive attack Demon Prince both seem nice. Being able to pull multiple units off the board while in melee are pretty good. The big damage one for 2 CP and a Flux token seems good for the Lord of Change or the Flamers. The other enhancements seem usable, and a few of the other stratagems could be okay situationally, like that debuff melee one. In general though, I'm a bit unconvinced by the detachment rule. It feels like it's just not a huge advantage for the demon player more so than the foe. as they can potentially just be bouncing those rerolls right back to you and just keeping them as an extra resource to reroll things if they happen to have big scary units with good saves or big guns with scary damage characteristics. Anytime you reroll a failed hit or wound roll on them, it can be kind of big. A fair few of the stratagems just seem kind of situational or costly, or like they're not really going to do so much compared with not using them. Overall, kind of feels like one where the flavour's pretty fun, though I think that a few of the options just don't really seem like they're that worth it. Even if a few units seem good, and warping things back to reserve out of combat seems like you could do a lot of mind games and shenanigans with. In general though, that's a pretty massive enormous rules drop for the demons. I'll be interested to hear which detachments you enjoyed the sound of the most. I think for me I'd probably put it as Slaanesh as the most interesting one with those enormous rerolls, then probably Khorne after that for some solid melee support, then the Tzeentch one with a few interesting options, at least on the enhancement front, and just for a bit of fun factor, and I feel like the Nurgle one is going to leave people rather disappointed, even if maybe you could do some sort of slightly horrendous board control scoring type thing, denying enemy shooting and then trying to stop them scoring primary perhaps. I feel like this would be more of a tournament thing than a casual thing if it did happen though, and probably still not all that strong nor fun. In any case though, feel free to check out the rest of the Grotmas videos, links down in the video description. I'll have the full playlist there. I'll look forward to talking Leagues of Votann tomorrow. Otherwise, as mentioned earlier, feel free to check out Deploymats, who sponsored the video. The Chaos Landscape one feels all very appropriate for the demonic denizens. As mentioned, they have their stylish 40k battle mats sold on Etsy, based in Australia, and the big selling point of them is to have a whole bunch of deployment zones marked out for the Pariah Nexus missions, so you don't need to measure them once you know which ones you're using. The lines and things are incorporated into the designs of the mats. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. They are rather fun, and I've certainly been having some good use out of my one that they sent me. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more videos like this. I do tend to post Warhammer 40k videos most days, and often more than that. Feel free to check out the Patreon page, which is links down in the video description, if you'd like to help support, and the channel's affiliate discount links too. Otherwise though, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.